Standard Bank is very active on the continent, very active within the trade space. If we have to keep the conversation within the trade agreement realm, the fact that the CFTA certainly is making progress, we would always like to see that progress to be a little bit faster and to have more urgency behind it. But I've said to the students many times, especially when the veto came from the US to the WTO for the selection of the appellate body judges, and they blocked it to say that we shouldn't blame, if the WTO is not functioning, we should look at the WTO as the table around which the countries come and sit to negotiate. And if we say that the WTO is not functioning, we can't blame the table. We have to blame the members that sit around the table that can't reach agreement among themselves in order to resolve matters. Can we think about the CFTA as like almost like a mini WTO for Africa? And how do you see, how is that impacting Standard Bank's business in Africa in terms of trade finance? Does it make a difference?
Thanks, Francois, and good morning to everyone. I want to perhaps start with, let me approach that question with the intention of the AfCFTA. So intra-Africa trade is nothing new. So the AfCFTA is not bringing a new thing where Africa is going to start trading with each other. You quoted, South Africa's major exports are into the continent. And we've had this for years. If you go back centuries, there's been trade with different countries. And what would happen is you take goods to the border, and used to be these communities around the borders, and then they would sort of cross the border and sell that to the other buyers in those communities. And then when we started having borders and now we are a country, those communities started being called smugglers, and that was not a bad thing. So for us as Standard Bank, where our business started as trade, back in Port Elizabeth or Gqeberha, it was about bringing traders together and seeing how do we help them, trade with each other by able to do so payment, and then that's how the business was built. Mm-hmm. So our purpose has been on the continent is that we are an African bank, and certainly all the shifts in the group in the last over 10 years has sort of signaled that. So what we see is that the biggest challenge we have with the international community is what I call perceived risk and versus the actual risk when it comes to the continent. Yeah. And it's always stark for us who sits in those forums, whether it's a WEF, Davos, or even other forums with the DFC or IFC. And we are a bank, we're a tier 1 bank, you guys recognize us as such, and then you want to talk about, there's this risk, and we are in those markets. So that's the one contention, and I think for me, this is where AfCFTA is really then creating that uplift, because now, if we can start to trust each other more as African countries, so it's not just about trade, it's down to policy, it's down to how do we perceive each other from a risk front. And I think institutions such as an Afrexim Bank has done phenomenally well to really practically bring things to tangibles on what AfCFTA can mean and practicalize that. Let's not forget that before AfCFTA we had regional economic communities, or RECs. And while some you can say very functional, if you look at the EAC or even here in SADC, you can question for how long they've been around, the progress that we've had. So how I think of AfCFTA is that it's an enhancement of what we've already been trying to work towards. Our issue, and I think my colleague here, Donald, is touching on it, trade agreements, but I'd like to say trade agreements versus policy. And that's where we need to understand the difference. So trade agreements is like the medieval marriage, all right? We put that in place, now we're bound to it. What we need rigorous policy that then informs the trade agreement, because whatever you put then in that trade agreement, whether we have it with China or not, the policies already enabled the business to stimulate the economy in the right direction, and you're focusing and ensuring that the sectors that you are then strategically trying to make sure benefit optimally from the trade agreement follows that. So for us, when we look at the AfCFTA and our operations on the continent, is to look at where it's functioning better. So East region or East Africa currently is a key focus for us because of that. Because you have a regional economic community that's functioning well, the overlay is AFCFTA and the other instruments that are there, such as the Guided Trade Initiative, the Pan-African Payment Settlement System, where SMEs, all the big companies, in paying each other, no longer are bound to having need for FX or for dollar. They can pay in a local currency. So you pay in your shillings, and then the person that you here in SA exporting to your buyer in Kenya, receive it in rands.
And I want to talk more about that this morning.
Yeah. So those are the practicalities that I'm referring to. And so what we're saying is that if the regional economic community is already, growing and is making shifts in policy that are really there to enable business to optimally, and it's not just about trade, it's also the freedom of movement. So you can set up your business easily in Rwanda, Kenya, Tanzania, or Uganda. So once you have those shifts, and it's really that's what really stimulates then business to really confidently trade in the region. And I think that's where my criticism is of SADC, because much bigger REC, run for longer, but if you compare the two, it's just not moving at a pace that we should be seeing it move. And ours from a Standard Bank perspective is to understand those complexities, but make sure we're not waiting for a trade area, then be an active bank. We are present in 20 African markets, and ours is to really practicalize that today for clients that are saying, I want to, or I am doing business in that market. And how do we ease that, whether it is our trade finance instruments or it's just, helping you understand the risk in that market, and therefore be able to then solution it correctly.